I was standing in the backyard of my childhood home in Clearwater, Florida, when I first noticed the construction crew tearing down the old iron fence that separated our property from what used to be the community garden. The sound of jackhammers made my teeth ache, but what really made my blood run cold was seeing the backhoe digging into the earth exactly where my grandparents and my baby sister were buried. My name is Quentin, and I had returned to Clearwater after 15 years working as a civil engineer in Seattle. The house had been sitting empty since my mother passed 2 years ago, and I finally had the time and emotional bandwidth to deal with the estate. The property was a modest 2-story colonial on Sunset Boulevard, built in the 1950s when Clearwater was still finding its identity between Tampa and the beach communities. My parents had bought it in 1982, and it held every important memory of my childhood. The backyard was special, though. In 1995, my baby sister, Emma, had died from complications during birth. My parents, devastated beyond words, had received special permission from the county to bury her on our property. It was an unusual arrangement, but my father had connections with the county commissioner at the time, and exceptions were made. My grandparents, who passed in 2003 and 2007 respectively, were also interred there at their request. They wanted to be close to their granddaughter. The small family cemetery had been properly registered with Pinellas County, complete with death certificates, burial permits, and a recorded plot map filed with the county clerk. I dropped my coffee mug and ran toward the fence line, waving my arms and shouting, "Stop! Stop digging right now!" A man in a yellow hard hat looked up from his clipboard, annoyed. "Sir, you need to step back. This is an active construction site." "This is my property. Those are graves you're about to dig up." He squinted at me like I had just told him the earth was flat. "This is HOA property, buddy. Has been for 3 months. We're putting in a parking lot for the community center." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "What are you talking about? This is my family's land, my mother's estate." The man pulled out a rolled blueprint from his truck and spread it across the hood. "See this? Pinewood Gardens Homeowners Association purchased this parcel in February. It's all legal. You got a problem? Take it up with them." He pointed to a section of the map that clearly showed my backyard as part of the construction zone. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called the first lawyer I could find on Google. It was barely 8 in the morning, but I left a frantic voicemail explaining the situation. Then I called my brother. Kenneth answered on the 3rd ring. "Kevin, you never call this early. What's wrong?" "They're digging up the graves, Ken. The HOA claims they own the land and they're building a parking lot right over where Emma and Grandma and Grandpa are buried." There was a long silence on the other end. My brother, Kenneth Quentin, was the mayor of Clearwater, elected 2 years ago on a platform of responsible development and community preservation. We had grown up in this house together, and those graves meant just as much to him as they did to me. "Don't let them dig another inch," Kenneth said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm making some calls right now. Give me 20 minutes. I walked back to the construction foreman, who was already directing his crew to start up the equipment again. "I need you to stop work immediately. There are human remains on this property." He rolled his eyes. "Look, pal, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we have permits from the city, the county, and the HOA. Everything is above board. If you don't step back, I'm calling the police." "Then call them," I said, planting my feet, "because I'm not moving, and you're not digging up my family." The foreman muttered something into his radio, and within minutes, a Clearwater police cruiser pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, and I recognized one of them from high school. Officer Martinez had been 2 grades above me, a linebacker on the football team. "Kevin Quentin, is that you?" Martinez looked surprised. "I heard you moved to Seattle." "I'm back, and these people are about to desecrate my family's graves." The foreman jumped in before I could explain further. "Officers, this man is interfering with permitted construction. We have all the legal documentation." Martinez held up his hand. "Everyone calm down. Let's sort this out." He turned to me. "You're saying there are graves here?" 3 of them. My baby sister Emma, buried in 1995. My grandmother in 2003. My grandfather in 2007. All legally interred with county permits. The plot is registered with Pinellas County. The second officer, whose name tag read Hensley, pulled out his phone and started making calls. After about 5 minutes of conversation, he hung up and looked at his partner. County records show a private family cemetery registered to the Quentin family at this address. 3 interments, all documented. The foreman's confident expression started to crack. That can't be right. The HOA did a title search. There was nothing about graves. Well, there should have been, Hensley said. This is now a potential crime scene. Nobody touches anything until we get this straightened out. My phone rang. It was Kenneth. I've got the city attorney looking into this right now. I also called the county medical examiner's office. They're sending someone out to verify the graves. Don't let anyone touch that ground. The police are already here. They've stopped the construction. Good. I'm coming over. I need to see this for myself. 20 minutes later, Kenneth pulled up in his personal car, not his official mayor's vehicle. He was dressed in a suit, ready for a day of meetings at City Hall, but his face was flushed with anger. We hugged briefly, and then he surveyed the construction site with a look that could melt steel. A black Lexus pulled up next, and out stepped a woman in her mid-50s with blonde hair styled in that particular way that seemed to require an entire can of hairspray. She wore white capri pants and a turquoise blouse, oversized sunglasses perched on her head. I had never met her, but I somehow knew exactly who she was. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, marching toward us like she owned the world. "Why has my construction been stopped?" Officer Martinez stepped forward. "And you are?" "Brenda Patterson, president of the Pinewood Gardens Homeowners Association. This is our property, and we have every right to develop it." Kenneth turned slowly to face her, and I saw her recognize him. The color drained from her face. "Mayor Quentin," she said, her voice suddenly much smaller. "I didn't realize you were involved in this." "These are my family's graves, Brenda," Kenneth said quietly. "My baby sister, my grandparents. Can you explain to me how your HOA claims to own this land?" She clutched her designer purse like a shield. "We purchased it legally from the estate. Everything was handled through proper channels." "What estate?" I demanded. "I'm the executor of my mother's estate. I never sold anything to anyone." Brenda's eyes darted between me and Kenneth. "There must be some mistake. Our lawyer assured us everything was in order." A white van from the Pinellas County Medical Examiner's office arrived, and a tall woman in professional attire stepped out. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist. After a brief conversation with the officers and reviewing the county records on her tablet, she approached the area where the backhoe had been digging. "I need everyone to stay back while I assess this," Dr. Chen said. She spent the next 30 minutes carefully examining the ground, taking photographs and consulting a map. Finally, she returned to where we were all standing. "There are definitely human remains here," she confirmed. "I can see evidence of at least one burial site that's been partially disturbed by the excavation. This is now a legal matter. No further construction can proceed until this is resolved." Brenda had turned pale. "But we had no idea. How were we supposed to know?" "By doing a proper title search," Kenneth said coldly. "By checking county records. By doing your due diligence before you buy property and start digging." A silver Mercedes pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit climbed out. He had silver hair and the kind of tan that came from yacht clubs and golf courses. "What's going on here? I'm Richard Harrison, attorney for the Pinewood Gardens HOA." Officer Martinez brought him up to speed, and I watched the lawyer's expression shift from confident to concerned to deeply worried as he understood the situation. "I need to see the documentation," Harrison said, pulling out his phone. He made several calls, his voice getting tighter with each conversation. Finally, he hung up and looked at Brenda with barely concealed fury. "Can I speak with you privately?" They walked to his car, and through the window I could see what looked like a very heated discussion. Brenda kept gesturing frantically while Harrison shook his head, his face growing redder by the minute. Kenneth's assistant called to say the city attorney had finished his preliminary review. Kenneth put the phone on speaker so I could hear. "Mayor, this is a mess," the city attorney, David Park, said. "The HOA filed paperwork claiming they purchased a strip of land from an estate sale, but the deed they recorded doesn't match the actual property boundaries. It looks like someone either made a serious error or deliberately falsified the documents." "Which one?" Kenneth asked. "I'm leaning toward fraud. The signature on the sale documents doesn't match the executor's signature on file with the county, not even close." I felt my stomach drop. Someone forged my signature? That's what it looks like, Mr. Quentin. I've already contacted the state attorney's office. They'll want to investigate this. Harrison and Brenda returned from their conversation. The lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Mayor Quentin, Mr. Quentin, on behalf of the HOA, I want to apologize. It appears there may have been irregularities in how this property was acquired. Irregularities? I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice. You mean fraud? You mean someone forged my signature to steal my family's burial ground? Brenda found her voice again, though it trembled. I want to make it clear that I personally had nothing to do with any irregularities. I trusted our property acquisition committee to handle everything properly. Who was on that committee? Kenneth asked. Brenda hesitated. Norman Patterson, my ex-husband, was the chair. Linda Sheffield and Tom Morrison were the other members. I need their contact information, Officer Hensley said, pulling out his notebook. Right now? While Brenda fumbled with her phone, another car arrived. This one was a red BMW, and an angry-looking man in his 60s jumped out. He had the same facial structure as Brenda, and I guessed this was the ex-husband. Brenda, what the hell's going on? Norman Patterson shouted. Why am I getting calls from the construction company saying the project is shut down? Maybe because you committed fraud, Kenneth suggested, his voice dangerously calm. Norman's face turned purple. I don't know what you're talking about. Everything was done legally. Then you won't mind explaining how you obtained property that was never for sale, I said, using documents with a forged signature. Norman's eyes shifted between all of us, and I could see the exact moment he realized how much trouble he was in. I want to speak to my lawyer. Good idea, Officer Martinez said. You're going to need one. Norman Patterson, you're under arrest for suspicion of fraud and forgery. He began reading Norman his rights while Hensley radioed for backup. Brenda was crying now, black mascara running down her carefully made-up face. I didn't know. You have to believe me. Norman handled all the property deals. The situation devolved into chaos over the next hour. 2 more police cars arrived. Linda Sheffield showed up after Brenda called her, took one look at the police, and immediately requested a lawyer. Tom Morrison apparently was out of state, but officers began the process of tracking him down. Kenneth pulled me aside while the police were processing Norman. I'm sorry, Kevin. I had no idea this was happening. How could you have known? You're the mayor, not a mind reader. I looked at the disturbed earth where my family rested. I just can't believe someone would do this. Who thinks it's okay to build a parking lot over graves? People who didn't know they were there, Kenneth said, but that doesn't excuse the fraud. Norman had to have known that property wasn't actually for sale. Someone at the HOA wanted this land badly enough to break the law. Dr. Chen approached us. I need to bring in a team to properly document and secure the site. The remains that were partially disturbed will need to be carefully excavated and reinterred. I'm very sorry for what you're going through. How long will that take? I asked. Ma'am, a few weeks, maybe longer. We'll treat your family with the utmost respect. I promise you that. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, meetings with lawyers, and media attention. It turned out that a story about an HOA trying to pave over graves to build a parking lot was exactly the kind of thing that made local news go crazy. By the 3rd day, I had reporters camped outside the house, and the story had spread to regional news networks. Kenneth held a press conference at City Hall, speaking both as mayor and as a family member affected by the situation. He was poised and professional, but I could see the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. This is a case of an organization that forgot the basic principle of respect for the dead, Kenneth said into the cameras. It's also a case of fraud and forgery that will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. My brother and I are grateful for the swift action of the Clearwater Police Department and the Pinellas County Medical Examiner's Office. A reporter shouted a question. Mayor Quentin, some people are saying you're using your position to get special treatment. What's your response? Kenneth's jaw tightened. Any citizen in this situation would receive the same protection under the law. The fact that my brother and I are related is irrelevant. Graves are protected by state and federal law. What happened here would be illegal regardless of who owned the property. The investigation moved quickly. Norman Patterson, it turned out, had orchestrated the entire scheme. The HOA had wanted to expand the community center and needed more parking, but the only available land was my family's property. When I didn't respond to several letters sent to my Seattle address asking if I wanted to sell, Norman had taken matters into his own hands. He had created fake estate documents, forged my signature, and filed them with the county clerk's office. The clerk who processed the paperwork later admitted that she hadn't thoroughly checked the documents because Norman was a respected member of the community. She was suspended pending an internal investigation. Linda Sheffield claimed she had trusted Norman's assurances that everything was legal. She cooperated fully with investigators and provided emails and text messages that showed Norman had deliberately kept the other committee members in the dark about the details. Tom Morrison, tracked down at his daughter's house in North Carolina, said the same thing. Brenda was the most interesting case. As HOA president, she had signed off on the project, but the evidence suggested she genuinely hadn't known about the fraud. She and Norman had divorced 3 years earlier after a bitter separation, and he had kept control of most of the HOA committees out of spite. She resigned as president immediately and cooperated with the investigation. I spent my days meeting with my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Ford, who specialized in property law and estate disputes. She was preparing a massive lawsuit against the HOA, Norman personally, and potentially the bonding company that had insured the construction project. "This is one of the most egregious cases I've seen in 20 years of practice," Rebecca told me during one of our meetings. "Not only did they commit fraud, but they disturbed a burial site. That's a third-degree felony in Florida. Norman is looking at serious prison time." "What about the HOA itself?" I asked. "The association will likely be financially liable for damages. You could argue emotional distress, desecration of graves, legal fees, and the cost of properly restoring the site. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more." "I don't care about the money," I said. "I just want my family to rest in peace." Rebecca gave me a sympathetic look. "I understand, but making them pay is how we ensure this never happens again." 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, Dr. Chen's team finished their work. They had carefully excavated and documented everything, treating my family's remains with the dignity they deserved. The graves were prepared for reinterment in their original locations, with additional protective measures to prevent any future disturbance. Kenneth and I held a small private ceremony when Emma, Grandma, and Grandpa were finally laid to rest again. It was just the two of us, a priest from our childhood church and Dr. Chen, who had requested permission to attend. The morning was clear and warm, typical Florida weather, with the smell of orange blossoms drifting from a neighbor's tree. "I'm sorry this happened to you," the priest said, "but your family's at peace now." I hoped he was right. Standing there in the backyard where I had played as a child, where Emma should have played, I felt a mix of grief and rage that I couldn't quite separate. Kenneth put his hand on my shoulder. "We're going to make this right." The criminal case against Norman Patterson proceeded swiftly. The state attorney's office charged him with multiple felonies, including forgery, fraud, and unlawful disturbance of human remains. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested. This case had generated too much public attention, and the state wanted to send a message. I attended every court hearing. Norman always avoided my eyes, sitting at the defense table with his shoulders hunched. He had aged 10 years in the past 2 months. His wife had filed for divorce, his country club had revoked his membership, and his adult children had released a statement saying they were ashamed of his actions. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the forged documents, handwriting analysis, testimony from the county clerk, emails showing Norman knew the property wasn't for sale, and most damning of all, a conversation recorded by Linda Sheffield, where Norman had admitted he needed to take care of the Quentin problem. I took the stand on the 8th day of the trial. The prosecutor, a determined woman named Angela Morrison, walked me through the discovery of the construction, the confrontation, and the emotional impact of finding out someone had tried to pave over my family's graves. "Mr. Quentin, can you describe what went through your mind when you realized what was happening?" Angela asked. I took a breath. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and torn out my heart. My sister Emma only lived for 3 hours. My parents never recovered from losing her. Being able to visit her grave, to feel close to her, was one of the few comforts they had. My grandparents chose to be buried there so Emma wouldn't be alone. And this man, I pointed at Norman, decided that his convenience, his parking lot, was more important than my family's eternal rest. Norman's lawyer objected, saying I was being inflammatory, but the judge overruled him. The jury needed to understand the human cost of Norman's actions. The defense's case was weak. They tried to argue that Norman had made an honest mistake, that he believed the property had been abandoned, that he never intended to disturb any graves. But the evidence of forgery was incontrovertible, and the jury wasn't buying it. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Norman's sentencing hearing was scheduled for a month later. In the meantime, my civil case against the HOA moved forward. Rebecca had filed suit seeking $2 million in damages, and the HOA's insurance company was desperately trying to settle. "They want to offer you $500,000, Rebecca told me over the phone. "It's a lowball, but it would avoid a long trial. What do you think I should do?" "I think we can get more. The jury in the criminal case just convicted Norman. Public sentiment is entirely on your side. If we go to trial, I believe we'll win, and win big." "Then let's go to trial." The HOA was falling apart. After Brenda resigned, 2 more board members quit. The remaining members were facing a revolt from homeowners who were furious that their association fees were being used to defend an indefensible case. Several families had put their homes up for sale, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. I ran into Brenda one day at a grocery store. She looked exhausted, her hair no longer perfectly styled, her clothes more casual and worn. She started to walk away when she saw me, but then changed her mind and approached. "Kevin, I just want you to know how sorry I am," she said. Her voice was quiet, none of the commanding presence she had shown that first morning. "I should have been more involved, should have questioned things more. I trusted Norman because he was the father of my children, and that was stupid." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell at her, to blame her for not stopping this, but another part of me recognized that she was a victim too, in a way. Norman had fooled a lot of people. "I appreciate you saying that," I finally replied. "I hope you're able to move forward." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. I never saw her again. Norman's sentencing arrived on a gray day in August. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a few HOA members who had supported him. Kenneth sat beside me in the gallery, his presence a silent show of support. Judge Elizabeth Cordero was known as a no-nonsense jurist who took a dim view of fraud. She had reviewed all the pre-sentencing reports, the victim impact statements I had submitted, and letters from both sides asking for leniency or harsh punishment. "Mr. Patterson," Judge Cordero said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "I have been a judge for 17 years. In that time, I have seen many cases of fraud, of people who thought they could circumvent the law for personal gain. But I have rarely seen a case with such callous disregard for human dignity as this one." Norman stood at the defense table, his lawyer beside him, his face pale. "You didn't just forge documents or commit fraud," the judge continued. "You attempted to literally erase a family's history. You were willing to pave over the graves of a baby, of elderly grandparents, to build a parking lot. The level of disrespect, of arrogance, is staggering." She sentenced him to 8 years in state prison, the maximum allowed under the sentencing guidelines. His lawyer immediately filed notice of appeal, but legal experts told me it was unlikely to succeed. The conviction was solid. As the bailiffs led Norman away, he finally looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, just the bitter resentment of a man who had been caught. I felt nothing but pity for him. The civil trial began in October. The courtroom was different from the criminal proceedings, less dramatic but just as important. Rebecca had prepared meticulously, building a case that went beyond just the monetary damages. She wanted to establish a precedent that would protect other family cemeteries from similar violations. We presented expert testimony about the emotional harm caused by grave desecration, about the cost of properly restoring a burial site, about the diminished property value caused by the scandal. We showed the jury photos of the disturbed graves, of the backhoe tearing into sacred ground, of my family's headstones knocked askew. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue that the association itself shouldn't be held liable for Norman's criminal actions, but Rebecca countered with evidence that the HOA's lax oversight and failure to properly verify the property acquisition made them negligent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rebecca said in her closing argument, "this isn't just about money. This is about accountability. The Pinewood Gardens HOA allowed one man to run roughshod over proper procedures, to commit fraud in their name, to destroy something sacred. They must be held responsible." The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they awarded me $1.8 million in damages. The HOA's insurance would cover most of it, but the association itself would still take a significant financial hit. Several news outlets reported that the HOA would likely have to dissolve and reform under new management. I donated a significant portion of the settlement to establish a foundation that would help other families protect and preserve private burial sites. Kenneth helped me set it up using his connections to get support from the city and county. The property itself became a point of discussion. I could have stayed in Clearwater, renovated the house, made it my home again. But every time I looked at that backyard, even with the graves properly restored, I felt the violation of what had happened. The peace of the place had been shattered. Instead, I worked with an attorney to establish the land as a permanent cemetery protected by conservation easement. No one could ever build on it, develop it, or disturb it again. I had the iron fence rebuilt, stronger and taller than before, with a plaque explaining the history of the site. Kenneth was there the day we installed the plaque. It was November now, almost a year since I had first returned to Clearwater. The Florida sun was gentler in the autumn, the humidity less oppressive. "Emma Quentin, 1995, Kenneth read from the plaque. "Margaret Quentin, 1926 to 2003. Harold Quentin, 1923 to 2007. May they rest in eternal peace, protected by the love of their family and the laws of our land." "It's good," I said. "It's what they deserve." "What are you going to do now?" Kenneth asked. "Are you staying in Clearwater?" I had been thinking about that question for months. "No, I'm going back to Seattle. My life is there now, but I'll visit regularly. And I know that Mom and Dad would be happy knowing that Emma and Grandma and Grandpa are safe." "They would be proud of you," Kenneth said, "for fighting for them." We stood there for a long time, two brothers in a backyard that held so much history. The orange tree was blooming again, the same tree that had been there when we were kids. Some things changed, and some things endured. The following spring, I received a letter from the Florida legislature. They had passed a new law, nicknamed the Quentin Protection Act, that required HOAs to conduct thorough searches of historical records before purchasing or developing any property. The law also increased penalties for grave desecration and made it easier for families to establish protected cemetery sites. Kenneth called me the day the governor signed it. "We did it, Kevin. This will never happen to another family." "Because of what happened to ours," I said. There was a bitter irony in that. "Yeah, but at least some good came from it." I flew back to Clearwater for the 1-year anniversary of the incident. The house had been sold to a young family who promised to maintain the cemetery and treat it with respect. They seemed like good people, and I trusted them to be proper stewards. The backyard looked beautiful. The new owners had planted flowers around the graves, had kept the grass trimmed, had polished the headstones. It looked like a proper memorial now, not just a family secret hidden behind a fence. I brought fresh flowers and placed them on each grave. "I'm sorry it took something so terrible to make sure you were protected," I said quietly. "But you're safe now. I promise." The wind rustled through the orange tree, and I chose to believe it was their way of answering. Norman Patterson's appeal was denied in February. He would serve his full sentence minus time for good behavior. The last I heard, he was working in the prison library, a far cry from his life of country clubs and HOA meetings. The Pinewood Gardens HOA did dissolve, just as predicted. A new association formed with completely different leadership and a strong emphasis on transparency and proper governance. They reached out to me with an apology letter signed by every member of the new board. I appreciated the gesture, even if it couldn't undo what had happened. Brenda Patterson moved to Atlanta to be closer to her daughter. I heard through Kenneth that she had found work as a real estate agent and was trying to rebuild her life. I hoped she found some peace. Linda Sheffield and Tom Morrison faced no criminal charges, but the scandal had tainted them in the community. Both eventually moved away, seeking fresh starts where nobody knew their names or their connection to the case. 2 years after everything began, I returned to Clearwater for Kenneth's re-election campaign. He won in a landslide, partly because of the way he had handled the crisis. Voters appreciated a mayor who would stand up for families, who understood that some things were more important than development and progress. We visited the graves together after his victory party. It was late, past midnight, and the neighborhood was quiet. The house's new owners had left the back gate unlocked for us, a kindness I appreciated. "Do you ever wonder what Emma would have been like?" Kenneth asked. "If she had lived?" I thought about it. Every day, I imagined she would have been smart, funny. Maybe she would have been an artist or a teacher. She would have had Mom's eyes and Dad's stubborn streak. She would have been 30 years old this year. Yeah. We sat there in the grass, two middle-aged men contemplating the sister we never got to know, the grandparents we missed, and the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. "I'm glad you fought for them," Kenneth said. "A lot of people would have just taken a settlement and walked away." "They're family," I said simply. "That's what you do." The next morning, I flew back to Seattle. My life was there, my career, my friends. But a piece of my heart would always remain in that backyard in Clearwater, where my family rested beneath the Florida sun. I started a blog about my experience, writing about the importance of protecting family cemeteries, about standing up to organizations that overreach their authority, about the dangers of unchecked HOA power. It gained a modest following, and I heard from dozens of people with similar stories. Most weren't as dramatic as mine, but they all shared a common theme. People who felt bulldozed by faceless organizations who needed someone to tell them it was okay to fight back. I began consulting with families who faced similar issues, offering my expertise as an engineer and my experience navigating the legal system. It became a second career, one that felt more meaningful than designing bridges and roads. 3 years after the incident, I received a wedding invitation from Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic anthropologist who had helped protect my family's graves. She had appreciated my advocacy work and we had stayed in touch. At her wedding in Tampa, I met a woman named Nicole Thompson, a teacher who worked with special needs children. Nicole had kind eyes and a laugh that reminded me of my mother. We talked all evening about everything except HOAs and graves and legal battles. She told me about her students, about the joy of watching kids overcome obstacles, about her love of mystery novels and terrible reality TV shows. We started dating long distance, her in Tampa and me in Seattle. It was inconvenient and complicated, but it felt right in a way nothing had for years. A year later, Nicole and I got married in a small ceremony on Clearwater Beach. Kenneth was my best man. We held a private reception afterward at the house on Sunset Boulevard, in the backyard where my family rested. The new owners graciously allowed us to use their property, understanding the significance of the location. "I think they would have liked you," I told Nicole, gesturing toward the graves. "You have the kind of spirit Emma should have had the chance to develop, the kindness Grandma and Grandpa always showed everyone." Nicole squeezed my hand. "I hope I get to honor their memory by being part of your family." Kenneth gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry. "My brother has always been the stubborn one," he said. "When we were kids, he once sat in a tree for 6 hours because I told him he couldn't. So when I saw him standing in front of that backhoe, refusing to let them touch our family's graves, I wasn't surprised. That's who Kevin is. He doesn't quit, he doesn't back down, and he doesn't let anyone tell him that something important isn't worth fighting for." Nicole and I moved to Tampa, a compromise between Seattle and her life in Florida. I opened a consulting firm specializing in property rights and land use issues. Kenneth and I saw each other regularly, our bond strengthened by everything we had been through. The Quentin Protection Act led to the discovery of dozens of forgotten family cemeteries across Florida. Local historical societies began documenting them, ensuring they would be preserved and protected. I worked with several of these projects, helping families navigate the legal process of establishing permanent protections. 5 years after the parking lot incident, I received a letter from a law student at the University of Florida. She was writing her thesis on property rights and grave protection laws, using my case as a central example. She wanted to interview me about the experience. We met at a coffee shop in Gainesville. Her name was Jennifer Park, and she was passionate about the intersection of property law and cultural preservation. For 2 hours, we discussed every aspect of the case, from the initial discovery to the final resolution. "What would you say to other people facing similar situations?" Jennifer asked, her recorder running. I thought carefully before answering. "I would tell them that it's worth fighting for. That graves aren't just holes in the ground, they're connections to our past, to the people who made us who we are. And I would tell them that the law is on their side, even when it doesn't feel like it. Organizations like HOAs can seem powerful and intimidating, but they're not above the law. Nobody is. Do you think what happened to your family could happen again?" "Not as easily," I said. "The laws are stronger now. People are more aware. But vigilance is important. We can't assume that just because something is protected on paper, it's safe. We have to pay attention, stay involved, and be willing to stand up when something's wrong." Jennifer's thesis won an award from the Florida Bar Association. She sent me a copy with a thank you note that said my willingness to share my story had inspired her to pursue property rights law. It was one of the most gratifying things I had ever read. Norman Patterson was released from prison after serving 6 years. I heard about it through Kenneth, who kept tabs on such things. Norman moved to a small town in North Georgia, near the Tennessee border, far from Florida and the disgrace that still followed his name. I felt no satisfaction in his punishment. The entire situation had been a tragedy that could have been avoided if one person had simply followed the rules, respected boundaries, and acknowledged that some things were sacred. Nicole and I welcomed our first child, a daughter, 7 years after the parking lot incident. We named her Emma Margaret Quentin Thompson, after my sister and grandmother. Kenneth was there at the hospital holding his niece with tears in his eyes. "They would have loved her," he whispered. "I know." We took Emma to visit the graves when she was 6 months old. It was a sunny day in April, the orange tree in full bloom, filling the air with its sweet scent. The new owners had continued to maintain the cemetery beautifully, and they welcomed us warmly. I held my daughter as I stood before the headstones. "This is your Aunt Emma," I told her, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "She only got to be here for a little while, but she's part of our family, part of you. And these are your great-grandparents, who would have spoiled you rotten." Nicole put her arm around me. "We'll bring her here every year. She'll grow up knowing where she comes from." "That's all we can do," I said. "Remember, honor, and make sure they're never forgotten." 10 years after I first saw that backhoe digging into my family's graves, I stood in a courtroom in Tallahassee as the Florida Supreme Court heard arguments in a case involving another family cemetery threatened by development. I'd submitted an amicus brief supporting the family, and I was there to watch justice hopefully prevail once again. The case was different in its specifics, but similar in its core issue. An organization claiming property rights that superseded a family's right to protect their dead. The family's lawyer cited the Quentin Protection Act multiple times in her arguments. The court ruled in the family's favor, 5-2. In her majority opinion, Justice Maria Flores wrote, "The sanctity of burial sites is a fundamental principle that transcends property rights and development interests. The legislature wisely strengthened these protections with the Quentin Protection Act, recognizing that some traditions, some spaces, some memories are too important to sacrifice on the altar of convenience." Kenneth called me after the decision was announced. "You started something important." "We started it together," I corrected. "You used your position to make sure the laws changed. You made sure it mattered. I'm proud to be your brother." "Same here." I spent my 50th birthday at the graves, just me and Nicole and Emma, who was now 8 years old and full of questions about the family she never met. She brought drawings she had made of what she imagined her Aunt Emma looked like, of the great-grandparents she had only seen in photographs. "Daddy, why did those people try to build on the graves?" my daughter asked. It wasn't the first time she had asked, but I answered patiently every time. "Because they made a mistake. They forgot that people are more important than parking lots. But when they realized what they had done, most of them felt terrible about it." "Did the bad man go to jail?" "Yes, honey, he did." Good. You should never hurt someone's family. Nicole and I exchanged glances over Emma's head, out of the mouths of babes, as they say. That evening we had dinner with Kenneth and his wife at their house overlooking Clearwater Harbor. Kenneth was in his third term as mayor now, with talk of a run for state senate. He had become a champion for family rights and local history preservation, using the lessons from our family's ordeal to shape policy. After dinner, Kenneth and I stood on his deck, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of beautiful Florida evening that made you understand why people flocked to this state, despite the hurricanes and humidity. "Do you ever regret coming back?" Kenneth asked. "All those years ago, if you had just stayed in Seattle, you never would have known what Norman was planning." I considered it. If I hadn't come back, they would have built that parking lot. Our family would be buried under concrete and car exhaust. Emma, Grandma, Grandpa, they would have been forgotten, treated like they never mattered. So no, I don't regret it. I wish it had been easier. I wish it hadn't required all the fighting and pain. But I don't regret standing up for them. Neither do I. We clinked our beer bottles together, a simple salute to family, to perseverance, to doing what was right even when it was hard. 15 years after the parking lot incident, I was invited to speak at a national conference on HOA governance reform. The organization had been born partly from the backlash against cases like mine, seeking to establish better standards and accountability for homeowners associations across the country. I stood at the podium in a Chicago hotel ballroom, looking out at hundreds of HOA board members, property managers, and homeowners. I had prepared remarks, but in the moment, I spoke from the heart. "I'm not here to demonize HOAs," I began. "Most associations are run by well-meaning people trying to maintain their communities. But my case illustrates what can happen when oversight fails, when one person has too much power, when the rush to develop and improve overrides basic human decency. Homeowners associations serve an important function, but they must never forget that they're dealing with people's homes, their histories, their lives. The moment an HOA forgets its humanity is the moment it becomes dangerous." The speech was well received. Afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own stories, to thank me for speaking out, to ask for advice. Many were board members who wanted to make sure they never made the mistakes that had plagued Pinewood Gardens. One woman, probably in her 70s, waited until the crowd had cleared to approach me. "Mr. Quentin, I was on an HOA board that did something similar 20 years ago. Not with graves, but we forced an elderly man out of his home over a dispute about his fence. He died 6 months later, and I've felt guilty ever since. Thank you for reminding us all that rules and regulations should serve people, not the other way around." I shook her hand. "It's never too late to learn from our mistakes. The important thing is that we do learn." Nicole and I eventually had 2 more children, both boys. We named them Harold, Kenneth, and David. Every summer, we would travel to Clearwater and spend a week visiting Kenneth, exploring the beaches, and always visiting the graves on Sunset Boulevard. My children grew up knowing their family's story. They understood that sometimes standing up for what's right is difficult, that justice doesn't always come easy, but that it's worth pursuing. Emma, now a teenager, volunteered with the foundation I had established, helping other families document and protect their burial sites. Norman Patterson died of a heart attack at age 79. I received a brief notification from an online obituary service I subscribed to for professional reasons. I felt no joy at his death, no sense of vindication. Just a sad acknowledgement that a man who had been so concerned with parking lots and property values had left very little positive legacy behind. 20 years after the parking lot incident, the house on Sunset Boulevard came up for sale again. The family that had bought it from the estate was relocating for work. Kenneth and I discussed buying it together, turning it into something meaningful. We purchased the property and established it as a heritage site, open to the public by appointment. The house itself became a small museum about family cemetery preservation, property rights, and the importance of standing up against institutional overreach. The graves remained private and protected, but visitors could learn about the story and why it mattered. On the 20th anniversary of the day, I first saw that backhoe Kenneth and I held a dedication ceremony for the heritage site. Local officials attended, along with representatives from preservation societies, legal advocacy groups, and several families whose own burial sites had been saved because of the laws that followed our case. Dr. Sarah Chen was there, gray-haired now but still sharp and committed to her work. Rebecca Ford attended, retired from active practice but still passionate about property rights. Even Officer Martinez showed up, now a sergeant with the Clearwater Police Department. I gave a short speech, keeping it simple. This place represents both the worst and best of human nature. It represents someone who was willing to commit fraud and desecrate graves for convenience. But it also represents a family that fought back, a community that supported justice, and laws that were changed to protect the vulnerable. Every grave here, every flower we plant, every time we tell this story, we're saying that people matter. That memory matters. That some things are worth fighting for. Emma, my daughter, now 21 and in law school, unveiled a new monument we had commissioned. It was a bronze sculpture of 3 interlocking hands representing family, protection, and continuity. Engraved on the base were the words, "In memory of those who rest here, and in honor of all families who fight to protect their sacred spaces." As the guests mingled afterward, Nicole found me standing alone by the graves. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'm good. I'm just thinking about how different things could have been if Kenneth hadn't been mayor, if the police hadn't responded quickly, if the laws hadn't been on our side." "But they were," Nicole said. "And even if they hadn't been, you would have fought anyway. That's who you are." She was right. I would have fought regardless of the odds, regardless of the cost, because these weren't just graves to me. They were my baby sister who never got to grow up. They were my grandparents who had loved me unconditionally. They were family, and family was worth everything. As the sun set over Clearwater, painting the sky in brilliant colors, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. The fight was over. The graves were protected forever. The laws had changed. Good had ultimately triumphed over greed and arrogance. Kenneth joined us, putting his hand on my shoulder in that familiar gesture of brotherhood. "We did it," he said simply. "Yeah," I replied. "We did." 23 years had passed since I first returned to this house, since I saw that backhoe and felt my world shatter. In that time I had aged, built a family, established a career, and helped change laws across an entire state. But more than any of that, I had honored my family. I had stood up when it mattered, fought when it was hard, and ensured that Emma, Grandma, and Grandpa would rest undisturbed for eternity. That evening, after everyone had left, I sat alone in the backyard one last time. The orange tree was still there, older and larger, but still producing its fragrant blooms. The grass was soft beneath me, and the headstones gleamed in the twilight. "I kept my promise," I said softly. "You're safe now. You'll always be safe." The wind rustled through the orange tree, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of children laughing. Life continued, as it always did. But in this small corner of Clearwater, Florida, in this carefully tended cemetery behind a house on Sunset Boulevard, the past was preserved, remembered, and honored. And that, I thought as I stood to leave, was all any of us could ask for: to be remembered, to matter, to know that someone loved us enough to fight for us, even after we were gone. The gate closed behind me with a soft click. Tomorrow I would fly back to Tampa, return to my normal life. But I would carry this place with me always, just as I had for more than 2 decades. It was part of me now, woven into the fabric of who I was. I was Kevin Quentin, the man who stood up to an HOA and won. The man who refused to let his family be paved over for a parking lot. The man who, with his brother's help, changed laws and protected countless other families from similar violations. But more than that, I was simply a son, a grandson, and a brother who loved his family. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered.